Hello, for anybody watching this video, this is part 2 of 3 of my Why Breath of the Wild Sucks video collection. So if you haven't seen the first part, links to it right here, and I would recommend watching that one first since I will be referencing certain things I said in that video in this one, so you'll probably want that context. If you have watched that one, welcome back, and let's get right into it. I'm going to start nice and simple with armor. First I'll explain how it works. So when you wear armor, they give you a defense increase by reducing incoming damage by the number that you see on the inventory screen. We can easily test this by using bombs. When we explode bombs plus, we can see them do 24 damage to enemy. So when we do the same to yourself, it does exactly 24 quarter hearts worth of damage. So when we put on armor that has a small armor value of, let's say 3, then we blow ourselves up, it should do 21 damage, and wouldn't you know it, that's true. So what happens when you wear armor that has a value higher than the damage received, like 28 defense armor? It reduces all damage to a single quarter of a heart, meaning with a fully upgraded set like this one, having a combined total of 84 means anything hitting you for less than 84 damage per hit only deals 1 damage, which is completely broken. Most things in this game don't deal anywhere near that level of damage. Even a silver bokoblin with a savage Lionel Crusher dealing 78 damage with a silver bonus of 24 is barely enough to break through, only dealing 18 damage, which turns even boss monsters into a complete joke. How am I supposed to feel engaged with an encounter with a boss that I'm fighting if it only hits me for 1 damage? He would have to hit me 108 times before I die. I mean, in what other game does any boss have to hit you 108 times before it can defeat you? But there's another problem with this system, and that's the beginning of the game. For most games, the beginning of the game is the easy part, but in Breath of the Wild, thanks to your low health, low armor situation, getting hit by a blue bokoblin will kill you outright, unless your health bar is completely full thanks to one-shot protection, and this feels incredibly cheap. But it doesn't end there. Even outside the Great Plateau, having your health bar completely devoured by practically every monster is in great abundance. And if you step your little toe outside of where they want you to go, you'll run into enemies that are too powerful for you to handle. And as I mentioned in my last video, I did not stick even close, even going as far to avoid the main paths, but you could argue I was playing the game wrong, and fair enough. But contrary to that, one of the first areas they try and get you to go after visiting Haytano Village is the Defined Beasts, and the closest one by far is Varuta. And to assist you going there first, they put quite a few NPCs around to try and net you into this area. But it's a sick trap left by the game developers, since Varuta is constantly shooting at rain. Combine this with the tiny stamina bar preventing the player from leaving the main path, and the rain reducing visibility, making it difficult to plan a route around. And if you do stick with the main path, have fun getting through enemies that shoot at you with electric arrows, dealing 30 damage. So I would recommend just jumping over the back of the entire area with cryosis up the waterfall to skip all those enemies and the long time it takes to wind all the way up the river instead. If you go over the waterfall, you're already close to Zora's domain as well. I just think the whole area was badly designed balance wise. If it was something that was thrown at the player later in the game with forced combat scenarios with much less armor like the DLC does, that would be great. And the DLC works on the fact that you have to be able to pull out the Master Sword before accessing the DLC, meaning at bare minimum you have to have 13 hearts with 52 hit points, meaning even without armor you can tank most things without being one-shot outright. But I think they could have made it so you start off with 5 heart containers instead of 3, making it much harder to be one-shot in the early game, and of course you just change the Master Sword's requirement to a nice round 15 instead. And with the Champion's Ballad they give you another heart container, so it would be a nice round 30 instead of 28. And for the armor, I think it needed to be a higher defense when you get one, starting with 5 damage resistance instead of 3. And upgrading armor at the Great Fairy gives you a flat increase of 5 every time, ending at 25 per armor piece and a maximum of 75 for a full set, instead of 84. Not much of a difference, but it would make more things able to deal more than 1/4 of a heart worth of damage, and it would balance the early game a little bit as well. The beginning of a game should never be harder than the ending, and I don't have a problem with being overpowered in video games, but it does depend on how you get that power. In Breath of the Wild, all you have to do is get enough money to be able to unlock the 4 fairy fountains and have the materials required to upgrade your armor set, which doesn't require you to overcome any hurdle or challenge. Link, you've just collected enough mushrooms and you are now ready to go defeat Ganon. His lasers will do barely any damage to you. Well done, Link. And that's really lame. For a better example of how to be overpowered in a Zelda game, look no further than Wind Waker. When you get the light arrow, you can one-shot any enemy in the game, but it's balanced by the fact that you only get it at the end of the game. Once you've overcome every required challenge and defeated all bosses and all dungeons and all the combat islands to form the Triforce of Courage, then you get the light arrows to play around with and have fun, but all of this without making any of the important stuff in the game trivial. The cooking is so broken. With my point before how Breath of the Wild has a nasty habit of one-shotting the player in the early game, the second that stops happening, another problem shows up, and that's this. Yep, every time you almost get one shot, you'll just pause the game and heal up, take another hit, and you'll do the same. And it's not like healing items are hard to come by, they're everywhere. So by the time you're finished with the Great Plateau, you'll probably have a decent amount, but you'll keep getting more and more. The more you keep playing the game. Now, open world games like Fallout have balance by limiting the amount of healing items you can carry by having weight stats. All things you pick up have weight, so if you want big guns, so you can tackle any enemy, that's your choice, but those big guns have high weights, so you won't be able to carry as much healing or armor. And if you want to do it the other way around, you can carry really good armor and be an absolute tank, but your damage output will take a hit. But it's up to the player to decide what kind of playstyle they prefer, but in Breath of the Wild, there is no decision. When I see my health bar drop, I'll do this. I'll pause the game and heal up. I won't run away, try and find a vantage point, or try for a more stealthy approach. I'll just eat more food, and that's really bad. So by now you've probably noticed Link up in the top left hand corner of the screen continuously burning and healing. Now I wanted to test how long Link could survive up on Death Mountain from just healing alone to prove my point of how stupidly strong being able to pause the game and heal up completely is. And as you can see, he's still going strong. There needed to be some kind of limit on it, because it's a little ridiculous that you can hold 3 whole screens worth of food that heals Link all the way up to full and then some. There's 60 slots of food, just as a by the way, and that's insane. 20 was easily enough. So I'm just gonna let Link keep burning there for the rest of the video. If you want to watch the full video of Link burning, link's right here.
Urbosa's fury is ready.
If you want broken, I'll give you broken. Urbosa's fury is completely busted. For anybody that has forgotten or needs a reminder of how it works by charging a spin attack, and it will send out a very large AoE, and anything in this area when you release the attack button will be dealt 500 points worth of damage to all enemies, as well as stunning them for 10 seconds, which is pretty overpowered because 500 damage is more than enough to defeat most enemies in the game, and you get 3 charges of this per cooldown for a whopping total of 1500 damage, which can pretty much defeat everything in the game with the exclusion of some bosses and Lionels, where Urbosa's Fury is much less effective. But aside from that one downside, that's why I really don't like this ability, because there's nothing to stop you from landing on top of a monster base and just spamming this move 3 times until everything's dead, which completely breaks the whole encounter. And all you have to do to get more is wait a measly 12 minutes for 3 more charges, and that completely breaks the final boss of the game as well. The other 3 champion abilities, while very useful in the final boss, are nowhere near as intrusive as Urbosa's Fury. And in Hyrule Castle, the cooldowns timers are cut in half. What were they thinking? Now I have a very simple way of how I would fix this move, and that's by removing the timer for Urbosa's Fury and replacing it with a point system. How it would work is each charge of Urbosa's Fury requires 100 points. How do you get these points? By hitting enemies. Each hit is worth 1 point regardless of how much damage was dealt, but you also get points for monster kills as well. So for just a regular red bokoblin, 1 additional point. For a silver bokoblin, 10 points. Let's say for a guardian stalker, 50 points, and for a silver Lionel, 100 points, etc, etc. And I know what you may be thinking, is that not more broken because now you can get Urbosa's Fury charges much more quickly than you could before? And I say no, because you have to get into combat in order to earn these Urbosa Fury charges. And no, you cannot chain Urbosa's Fury, so any monsters defeated by Urbosa's Fury do not give any points back, because that would just recreate the same problem we already have of avoiding combat with this thing. So I think this is a much better system where you earn points through combat instead of just being handed to you for free every 12 minutes. And the way you activate this ability should also be changed. The way you activate this ability is you have to stand still and charge it with a spin attack. For the most part it works fine, but it can be really annoying when you just want to do a spin attack and not waste an Urbosa's Fury charge. But it's worse when you're using a spear, because spears have a unique move where you charge an attack and instead of doing some kind of spin attack you do a bunch of really extremely quick flurries, which is good at dealing a lot of damage to a really tanky target, but you end up using an Urbosa's Fury charge, which really sucks. And yes, I do know you can disable them by going into the pause menu, but I don't need to tell you why that's wrong. I don't like pausing the game unless absolutely necessary, especially when you could just map it to, I don't know, clicking down both the thumbsticks, and then you could use that cool spinning animation Link does when he gets Urbosa's Fury for the first time, instead of sharing the same activation as another move. So it would work by clicking down both thumbsticks, which makes Link stance up like he does when he's performing a spin attack, where it reduces his movement speed because that's good design, so you can't just whip it out instantly, you have to pick the right time to use it, and once charged you press the attack button to activate it. And you can also press the X button to cancel it if you somehow accidentally did it or decided it was a bad time to use the move. And just like that, this move is much less clunky and annoying to use and activate. Another thing I hate about this item is you can just rush it from the second you leave the Great Plateau, as well as being by far the closest divine beast, so it doesn't take very long to get either. All you have to do is go to the Gerudo town, then cross the desert, then go to the Yuga clan, then teleport back to the Gerudo town and go board Naboris, then beat the dungeon, and if you know what you're doing, this could take a little more than an hour, and most of that time would be spent slowly crossing the desert. That's the problem, since it's such a powerful item, and it's a mainline story item, meaning you can't miss it, combined with the fact that you can just rush it from the get-go and have it for the entire game feels broken. It feels like a secret item that you'd normally unlock after doing something like the Cave of Ordeals, and that would be great. If you could beat the Cave of Ordeals with only 3 hearts, then you deserve an item like this. You've proven that you've mastered the combat in this game, so having a powerful item like this doesn't really make much of a difference to you, since you've proved you can destroy any obstacle the game can throw at you. Stasis is easily the coolest of all Sheikah Slate abilities in my opinion. There's a lot of ways you can use this ability. Obviously the main use is holding objects in place for a certain amount of time, which is its main use, but it has other utilities like being able to hold down switches, and when upgraded it can be used to hold enemies in place while you get some free hits in, and it stuns them after they break out as well. While useful for single enemies like bosses, not so much for groups of enemies, but none of that comes close to being able to build up kinetic energy on paused objects, allowing you to do some pretty incredible things with it. The easiest example of this is Stasis tree jumping, something I'm not super great at personally. Boulders are much easier, but it's something super impressive to watch. I think Stasis is one of the main reasons they added a physics engine in the first place, and yeah, what's the point of having a physics engine if there's no way for the player to meaningfully interact with objects in the game? It's really cool to see objects interact with other objects as well as the player and the environment. A great example of a game that does this really well is of course Half-Life 2. It has so many different objects and most have different ways of interacting with other things. For example, barrels float on water as well as most wooden objects, while something like a cinder block sinks. All objects have different weights, and I would be doing Half-Life 2 a massive disservice if I didn't mention the gravity gun. This device allows players to interact with most objects in a meaningful way by being able to pick up these objects and launch them at high velocities, as well as many other things, and it was a really good showcase of how physics and objects interacted, as well as just being fun to use. And I mention all this because these two things are pretty similar in that way. They both allow the player to manipulate objects in their respective games, but Breath of the Wild has a fault where Half-Life 2 does not. Now imagine the gravity gun requires ammo. The gravity gun just got about 10 times more lame with that decision. Instead of being something that has a lot of utility and creativity behind how you use it, you now limit the ways the player can use it. Breath of the Wild has this limit. While you can stasis for free with only a little cooldown, you cannot however generate momentum for these objects, which is the fun part, without using your weapons, which is a massive problem because, as we all know, this will absolutely shred all the weapons in your inventory if you're using this ability excessively. Case in point, tempered power. Now I just heard everybody that knows what shrine I'm talking about wince simultaneously, and that's because it perfectly highlights the problem with the overuse of stasis, because you have to get a glowing orb into the hole at the other end of the room, and this requires trial and error. Too much oomph and you'll overshoot it, too little and you'll be way too short, and all this while wasting the durability on your weapons. But there was an incredibly easy solution to this problem, and that's with this. Now I don't mean the Kukiri sword, but it does tick all the boxes. Unlimited durability, low damage and short range. Perfect. Something like this needed to be in the game. Of course, it would be found in the Shrine of Resurrection along with the other two pieces of armor, and this fixes stasis at the same time because you would just use the Kukiri sword to build up kinetic energy instead of wasting your other weapons, which is a good thing, allowing the player to experiment and play around more with stasis. Which in my opinion is the most fun mechanic in the game. That's a great thing because it allows for more creativity, and the Kukiri sword would be also very useful for low health enemies like keys and skeletons, so you would not have to waste the durability on your good weapons when fighting them. And I bet there would have been so many people that would do a can you beat Breath of the Wild using only the Kukiri sword runs, and I would have loved to do that as well. The barbarian armor would be a must, as well as any food items that increase damage. That would have been really cool to see, but no. And while you're at it, you might as well add a bow with unlimited durability as well. It does 1 damage and works just like a bow, but you can't change arrow type, and it has a single arrow that when it hits something it returns to your bow after 2 seconds, so you can't just spam it either. And that means you can use other bows to your heart's content as weapons, because you don't have to worry about your arrow count or your bow's durability, because you'll always have this one to fall back on. If you're in a shrine and you need to save arrows, or all your bows are on low durability, this is a paranoia I always had when playing Breath of the Wild. I knew full well that plenty of shrines needed you to use a bow, so in combat I never used the bow, and that's really unfortunate because it's quite fun to use it. And I know I never would have run out of bows because there's no shrine that requires heavy use of a bow, but like I mentioned in my last video, I didn't find Hestu until I beat the game, so I only had 4 bows to play around with, and pretty early on I found tempered power and ran out of weapons, so I had to leave and come back, and that didn't feel good, so I never wanted that to happen again, so I just never used the bow. These are 2 combat techniques you can pull off while fighting monsters, so I'll explain how they work. First, with a Flurry Rush, you are required to perform a backflip or a side hop at the correct timing during an enemy's attack. And for the shield parry, you are required to perform a shield parry at the correct timing during an enemy's attack. You see the problem? They have the same trigger, meaning they're competing with each other because you can easily swap one out for the other. You can backflip instead of shield parry, and you can shield parry instead of backflipping, so I'd like to compare them both directly and find out their strengths and weaknesses. I'll start out with the Flurry Rush. When performed, the game goes into slow motion where Link will rush into an enemy and do, well, a flurry of attacks. 8 attacks for one-handed weapons, 8 strikes for spears, and 4 for two-handed weapons. Let's say you're using the Master Sword, which deals 30 damage per swing. That's a total of 240 damage for one Flurry Rush, which is not too shabby. And you can find much higher damage weapons like a Savage Lionel Crusher that deals 78 damage per swing, and you get a total of 624 damage in one Flurry Rush, which is a ton of damage. Okay, let's talk about the shield parry. When performed on an enemy, it will cause that enemy to drop their weapon and recoil, allowing for about 2 free hits. Still, very useful for when they do drop their weapon because it will allow you to pick it up and get a free weapon in the process. This also makes it so the enemy you are fighting is much less dangerous and more vulnerable for the rest of the fight. That's all well and good until you consider you could have just Flurry Rushed them instead and just killed them outright, and not have to waste time picking up the weapon and then whack them for the rest of the fight when they could already be dead. And it gets even worse when you consider the risk and reward element. If I backflip and miss time, the only punishment I get is not getting the Flurry Rush. There is no risk, only reward, since by backflipping I'm already moving myself out of danger. It's just a plus if I get the Flurry Rush. But for the shield parry, I have to be actively trying to get a shield parry, but if I mistime it, one of two things will happen. Either Link is taking a whack, or my shield is, depending on if I was too early or too late on the shield parry. But it gets even worse when you consider some of the more potent threats in Breath of the Wild, like the Lionels and the Tests of Strength Guardians. While yes, can be parried, they cannot drop their weapons, period, which would be very overpowered, yes, but at the very least it would make it so the shield is more useful, and both of these enemies are by no means defenseless without them. So with that in mind, the only enemies that can be shield parried effectively is these three, not including their skeleton counterparts. And the only one variant of these three enemies I would actually recommend shield parrying is this one, the silver ones, for two reasons. Flurry Rush isn't usually strong enough to defeat these guys outright, and disarming them is extremely useful here since the fight is much longer thanks to their meaty health bars, and the weapons they carry are usually royal gear, so removing these weapons from them allows you to just wail on them until they're dead. So aside from this one example of how shield parry is better, the Flurry Rush is always the better choice 9 times out of 10. Now there is shield parrying projectiles, but since Flurry Rush has no countermeasure at all, I'm not going to count it since it's not a fair comparison since all projectiles are handled by the shield. There's also another very small downside to the shield parry, and that's for 2 of the 3 weapon types, only one of them has easy access to the shield, while the other 2 require you to put your weapon away first in order to use the shield parry. And just for the final kick in the shin to the shield, you can flip and hop at all times with both spear and two-handed weapons. For at least the two-handed weapons, you should not be able to jump around. For a little bit of balance, you should have to sheath your weapon first before being able to flip, and by extension, Flurry Rush. Now that's all I have to talk about with gameplay and mechanics for Breath of the Wild. So for my next video, I'll be comparing strengths and weaknesses of other Zelda games and comparing them to Breath of the Wild, and it's waiting for you right there. So hope to see you there, and thanks for watching.